This week I'll be answering your questions you asked a few weeks ago when I put out the call on my community tab. First of all, thank you if you asked a question. I really appreciate having all of you in this community, and we've got some really great questions that I'll be attempting to answer now. Also, I've just reached 65,000 subscribers, so if you've recently subscribed, thank you so much for joining this community of photographers. And if you've been subscribed for a while, again, thank you for being part of the community. And if you haven't subscribed already, do it now, and whilst you're there, turn on notifications with that bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. I've got so many more coming out that I think you're really going to like. Now, the first question is from Ugson, and they've asked, what do you think the future holds for DSLR cameras when they become obsolete? I think they'll probably go the way of film cameras. So there'll be a time where people will still be using them and will refuse to go away from them. And then those people will slowly drift across to mirrorless cameras. And then I think in years to come, they'll come back, a bit like film cameras have done. Now, I don't think DSLRs will ever go away completely. And I think there'll be a lot of people, from photojournalists to sports shooters and people like that, that'll just keep on using DSLRs. And they'll probably have a lens lineup that's ridiculously expensive. So they'll be really resistant at changing to a mirrorless system or anything like that. I think it would take them quite a lot to change over to the mirrorless system. I think as eye autofocus and things like that are kind of tailored towards the mirrorless system, as they develop and they become better and better, this will start to bring more people across. But I think DSLRs are going to be around for quite a few years to come. But it's a great question, and it'll be interesting to see what actually happens. Now, the next question was from Rainer, and he asked for a comparison between the 50mm f2.8 prime and the 24-70mm f2.8 zoom lens. Which one would I pick and why? Now, this is also an interesting question, and it's quite a tricky one. I think the 50mm f2.8 is an interesting lens. I think they've kept the aperture to f2.8 to keep that size of that lens down. And because it's a prime lens, it's not going to have as much glass in it as that zoom lens. But nowadays, zoom lenses are developing so much. So personally, I would probably go for the zoom because it's a similar aperture and it's a lot more versatile. It'll give you so much more flexibility when you are using it over the prime lens. If I was going to go for a prime lens, I'd probably go for the 55 f1.8 or the 50 f1.8 if I was on a budget. And this would really give me that wider aperture. With primes, you really want them around f1.8 to f1.4 just to get that much wider aperture. Because if you're using a 24-70, you've got the versatility of all of those different focal lengths. So the trade-off between using primes and zooms is that wider aperture. So with prime lenses, I use these a lot, but I make sure they are f1.8 or wider. Whereas with my zoom lenses, I make sure they're f2.8 to f4, depending on what I'm using them for. The next question is from Guile23120402. So I'm guessing just Guile wasn't available as a username, but that's the thing with YouTube, there's so many people on here now. Anyway, Guile asks about trying to learn how to use their camera. This may sound bad, but can you answer my question about depth of field, like the distance that I need to be from my subject with a 35, a 50, a 60, an 85, and micro lenses? I'm guessing you mean macro lenses there. Sorry, but that's what I'm struggling with. Using different focal lengths will kind of give you different distances you need to be to get that background blurry, which I'm guessing what you're trying to achieve. With a longer focal length, you can be further away from your subject, whereas with a wider focal length, so say if you're shooting with a really wide angle lens, you'll have to be a lot closer to your subject. So it all depends on the distance between you, your subject, and the background. If your subject is really close to the background, it's really hard to get that background blurry. Whereas if they're close to you, you can focus on them and that background will become more blurry. But if you're shooting with a longer focal length, you'll then have to come back a little bit from that subject. So you basically need to go out and practice as much as possible with all of those different lenses or all of those different focal lengths. One of the good things is getting a zoom, say like the 24-70, or if you're on a crop sensor, the 16-55 or 18-55, depending on which system you're on. If you get those, just play around with the focal lengths and hold the aperture as wide as possible just to see how it affects your subject and the background. And also photograph your subject as close to the background as possible and as far away from the background as possible. So you're changing that distance between you, your subject, and the background. Now, if you want a deeper depth of focus, what you need to do is close your aperture down, and this will deepen that depth of focus. So it's all about playing with your aperture, playing with your distances, and playing with those different focal lengths. But you just want to go out and shoot as much as possible, because the more you use your kit, the more you'll start to understand it. The next question is from Console Authority, and they asked, what made you decide to incline more on the educational side for the YouTube channel? The one main thing that made me go down the educational side was because I love shooting photography and I love teaching people about photography. It's great when you see people learn from the things that you've shown them. And this is what I love doing. And also, the one thing that really annoyed me about YouTube was, say if I clicked on a subject and then I'd have to wait 10 minutes for that subject to be brought up in that video. This was really annoying, and it got to the point where I had some spare time, so I just started making YouTube tutorials. I really like doing those short, quick tutorials where I just give you the information you need and nothing more and nothing less. I've got, I think, over 300 videos now on my channel, so go through my channel, and if there's anything that you're learning about in photography, I've probably done a tutorial on it. The next question is from Ilya B. And Ilya asks, is it harmful for a camera sensor to shoot a sunrise for time-lapse, especially a mirrorless one, as the sensor is constantly exposed to the bright sun for a long period of time? Can it damage the sensor permanently? Thanks. I don't worry too much about photographing time-lapses of the sun rising through my shot. What you'll find is when the sun is close to the horizon, it does have to shine through a lot more atmosphere than when it's directly above you. So if you're shooting with a really wide angle lens, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Now, the one thing that will cause damage to your lens and potentially to your sensor is if you've got a telephoto lens on your camera. This will then magnify that sunlight, and then what it'll do is basically burn a hole in part of the lens or maybe in the sensor. I've seen this happen when people are trying to photograph eclipses and they don't use a proper solar filter. So if you're shooting super wide, it's not too much of a problem, whereas if you're on a telephoto lens, I'd really kind of stay away from pointing it directly at the sun. Now, I've lived in Dubai for a while, and when we were living there, what I found was there was so much haze and dust in the atmosphere that I could actually use a telephoto lens when the sun was just coming over the horizon. But after a while, and after a really short while, that sun would get really bright. So I was very careful in what I was doing. So, short answer to your question, if you're shooting super wide and it's just when the sun is coming up in the time lapse, don't worry too much about it. If you're using a telephoto lens, you just need to be a bit more careful then. The next question is from, now I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this, but the next question is from this person. And they ask, does the A7R2 have FTP transfer just like the A7 III? I bought an A7R2 to combine it with the A7 III, and thanks in advance. I used to own the A7R2, but I don't anymore, so I can't check it. But I'm guessing with the updates and things like that, I'm guessing that the A7R2 doesn't have it. If you look in your menu, and I think it's tab 3, which is the connectivity one, if it has the FTP option in there, you should be able to connect through an FTP function. If it's not in there, you won't have that function in there. So I think the camera is just a little bit too old for this function because it's a much newer function, or it was more of a pro level function in earlier cameras. Now, the next question is from Craig Furlong, and he asks, would you consider doing more tutorials with camera phones? Your astrophotography with the Huawei P30 Pro is outstanding. I'd love to see more tutorials on camera phones. Can't wait for the new moon. Thank you for the videos. I've learned so much. Well, thanks very much for the question, Craig. And camera phone photography is one thing that I would like to do more of. And it's one of those things that is really developing at the moment, from computational photography, where basically the brains in the camera phone helps with your photography. It hasn't quite got the quality of the big full frame cameras, But you can get some amazing shots with a camera phone when you know how to use it properly. So in the future, I probably will be doing some more tutorials with camera phones. Sean Wu said, I'm considering the FE 35mm f1.8 as my next lens, but it seems to have significant chromatic aberration issues. A lot of people say it's easy to deal with, but I'd like to know how, as I don't find it easy to remove low CA, whereas lateral CA is fine. Now, I'm actually shooting this with the 35mm f1.8 right now, and I haven't found too many problems with it. I think the only way that you probably are going to get chromatic aberrations, and you'll see those chromatic aberrations, is if you're photographing the stars maybe with this lens. Then all you do again is just close that aperture down a little bit. That's the best way to deal with chromatic aberrations with any kind of lens really, is just to shut that aperture down a little bit and it gets rid of most of it. And if you're taking photographs, just click on that remove chromatic aberrations. And I think there are a few other ways to get rid of it in Photoshop as well. The other thing you can do is just watch a few tutorials online as to how to get rid of those two different types of chromatic aberrations. The next question is from Priska Sana, and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. But Priska Sana asks, how do you clean your camera? When it comes to cleaning my camera, I don't worry too much about the camera itself. The sensor is the main one that I worry about cleaning. Now, I have done a video on cleaning your sensor already. I've linked it in the corner and in the description. So if you haven't seen that video yet, go and watch that one, and I teach you all about how to clean your sensor. As for cleaning the outside of the camera, I just have a blower and a lens cloth as well. So if I've got an old lens cloth, I can wipe off any bits of dirt, and then any other loose bits of dirt, I just use the blower just to try and get it clean. Now, when I'm not using my camera, it does live in my bag or my camera drawer, so it's normally in quite a safe place. It does get a little bit dirty, but not too dirty. Asok commented saying that they would love to do astro and landscape photography and filmmaking as well, and their budget is really tight. So would I be able to purchase the Canon M50 and a 50mm f1.8? Now, the Canon M50 is a crop censored camera. The 50mm on that crop sensor would be more like a 75 to 80mm. So it is quite a tight lens, especially for astrophotography. And when you take into consideration the 500 rule, or if you're really conservative, the 300 rule, then you're really limiting the shutter speed that you'll have with that lens. It would be much better to get a really wide angle lens. Say, for instance, if you're on a budget, the Samyang 12mm, I think it's in the f2, that's really good. If you've got a bit more of a budget, the Sigma 16mm f1.4 is a really good one for astrophotography and landscapes as well. Now, the 16mm does give you around about a 23 or 24mm full frame equivalent on the Canon M50. I've got this one for my A6600 and it's fantastic for astrophotography as well as landscape. It's a little bit wider than the 50mm, or it's a lot wider than the 50mm. You'll get a lot of those big sweeping vistas if that's what you want to photograph. The 50mm will be good for landscapes, but it won't be as good for astrophotography. The next question is from Ravi Chandran, and he asks, which metering mode is best for portraits, spot or matrix metering? Where should we put our focus point? On the eyes or on the chin or on the forehead, or shadow parts of the face? For portraits, I tend to shoot in manual mode, so the metering mode doesn't really do much for me in that manual mode. I also shoot with flash, so this adds another element to my portraits. But basically, you want to expose well for the face. If you've got lots of bright parts in the background, you almost just want to ignore those unless they're important for the shot. So you just need to go out, and I keep saying this and I'll always keep saying this, just go out and shoot as many portraits as possible, and then you'll learn what works for you and what doesn't work for you as well. As for focusing, if you have one of the newer cameras with that eye autofocus, just switch that on and start shooting with that eye autofocus. If you've got an older camera that doesn't have that, what I'd tend to do is close my aperture down a touch. So I'd be shooting, if I had a 1.8, I'd probably be shooting at 2.8, maybe f4, maybe f5.6 to really get most of that face in focus. And then what I'd do is probably focus on the cheek. So because of that smaller aperture, the eye would still be in focus. But for your portraits, the eyes definitely need to be in focus. So you need to keep checking, keep zooming in on the back of your camera to make sure you're getting focus. If the eyes are out of focus, close your aperture down a little bit so you get more of the face in focus. Or if it's not working when you focus on the cheek, just focus slightly back and see how that works. But again, just practice as much as you can. Portraits are really hard. Autofocus has made it a lot easier, and it means that we can shoot at a lot wider apertures. But for portraits, it's imperative that you get the eyes in focus. So it is a tricky one, but just practice as much as you can. So I decided to come down to the beach and answer the last questions. And the next one's from Rodrigo Thomas, and he's asking which file holds the most data. Is it PNG, is it a TIFF file, or is it a PSD? Just wondering, because when you export a photo to work on it and you bring it back to replace the one in Photoshop, for example, I want to use the biggest one. So the whole premise of all of these different file types is a little bit tricky, because some of them are non-destructive, some of them are destructive. As long as you use a non-destructive file, it doesn't really matter too much. And sometimes you can get a file that's huge, but doesn't really have to be huge. So if you're building a composite, or if you're layering in certain things into your shot, you may be doing an astrophotography shot with a different foreground, it may be tracked or something like that. So you are going to have those different layers. Both TIFF and PSD files both have layers in them, and they both save layers in them as well. So unlike where you save a JPEG, it flattens the image, both a TIFF and a PSD file both save those layers. So it saves a lot of data into the file, and they're both pretty big files. So I don't think you're going to compromise any kind of quality, whether it's a TIFF or a PSD. Now a PNG, I normally just use a PNG file for, say, if I'm doing something like a logo with a transparent background. And I think a PNG is mostly used for that type of scenario. In saying all that, TIFF files do have a few advantages. One of them is they can be saved bigger than 2 GB. So if you've got loads of data, loads of layers and everything like that, you probably want to save a TIFF file. Whereas a PSD file, once it goes over 2 GB, I think you've got to save it as a PSB file. So there is that limitation. There is the industry standard as well. So if you're sending it to a graphic designer, they may be able to, or they might want a TIFF file over a PSD file. So I'd say if your files are huge, or if you're putting loads of layers in there, just save it as a TIFF file. However, if the file's smaller or you don't have as many layers in there, just save it as a PSD file. They're both non-destructive, so you won't lose any data, or you won't lose any information that you've taken in the first place. The next comment was from Spencer Olson, and he's been very kind, saying that I'm the reason for why he knows his A7 III front to back. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. I've done loads of tutorials on the A7 III. I use that camera every day, so I just want to pass that knowledge on to you guys. So Spencer asks, when am I going to be coming to the States? Because he'd love to go shooting with me and do a project or something like that. He's currently in New Orleans with the Marine Corps. Now that's fantastic of you to ask that, Spencer. Obviously, with the current lockdown situations and the travel restrictions, it's not going to be anytime soon. But if I am in the States and we are traveling around, I'll definitely give you a shout, because we'd love to go there. There's so many amazing places to photograph in your country. So it's one of the countries that's on our bucket list. I haven't been there for over 10 years now, but I'd love to get back there. But hopefully the borders will open up soon. We'll be able to start traveling again soon, and then we'll probably try and come and visit. The next question is from Malika Jun. Now, I'm sorry if I've pronounced that badly. I'm from the UK and we're renowned for pronouncing things really badly. Now, Malika Jun was asking about becoming a wedding photographer in India, and they listed a whole list of lenses, but with the A7S III. Now, for photography, the A7S III does take photographs, but it's more a camera that's dedicated to videography. So the megapixel count will be low. It'll be down to, I think it's 12 megapixels, somewhere around there. So you're not going to get huge images from it. Instead of the A7S III, for photography, I would get the A7R3, the A7 III, the A7R4. These will have a much higher megapixel count and will give you much better images, and much better image quality. The problem with wedding photography is everything's happening so quickly that you might get a photo, but you might not frame it up perfectly. And if you're photographing on the A7S III, with that low megapixel count, you can't actually crop in. Whereas if you're working with the A7R4, you've got all those megapixels to work with. It's over 60 megapixels. So if you make a mistake or if something happens really quickly and you capture that moment but you haven't framed it perfectly, with all those extra megapixels, you can crop into the image and it'll still look really good and it'll still look much nicer. Whereas with the A7S III, you won't have that option. And to be honest, if you're blowing up images or if you're doing shots of a wedding and they want massive images of them, then you're not going to have the megapixel count to produce really big prints. As for the lenses, I've seen you've gone for the 3 Tamron lenses, taking you from 17 to 180 millimeters, the Sigma 50 millimeter 1.4 and the Tokina 85 millimeter 1.8. They're all really good lenses. You've got 2 for that shallow depth of focus look, and you've got the 3 to be able to use. So you've got the range from 70 to 180 millimeters at f2.8. That would be a really nice lens combination to have. However, the one thing I would look into as a wedding photographer is 2 camera bodies, and 2 camera bodies with higher megapixel count because of the reasons that I've just mentioned. With 2 camera bodies, you could just shoot with the 17 to 28 and the 70 to 180, and then you'll be able to get super wide shots really quickly and then telephoto shots really quickly. You won't be changing lenses, you won't be telling people to wait, you won't be missing those moments. And that is the thing with wedding photography. The next question is from Tata Limnu. Again, sorry about the mispronunciation if it's pronounced differently. Fine dust is a very big problem in landscape photography. How can I remove it? Now, I think someone answered the question already in the list, but the main thing with dust is there's not much you can do about it. With mirrorless cameras, that dust is going to get on that sensor. You just need to get a blower, and what I do every time I go out and shoot, I'll blow into the sensor and turn the camera upside down so any dust will hopefully get out. And then the back of the lens, I'll blow that with a blower as well, and then the front of the lens, I'll have a lens cloth and the blower as well. So you just need to keep on top of it. Now, the other thing you can do if the dust is really stubborn on your sensor is to get a lens cleaning kit. Now, it seems really daunting, but it actually isn't. They have these blades, it has a solution in it, and you basically drag the blade across your sensor. So as long as you've got rid of the stubborn bits, and as long as you've used the blower to get rid of any bits of grit or anything like that, then you can use the sensor cleaner kit to get rid of those more stubborn bits of dirt. It's one of the things that I've already done a video on, so if you haven't seen it yet, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. The next question's from Amy. And Amy asks, which of your pictures are you most proud of and why? Which picture do you wish you could take over again and why? Now, this is a tricky one, I've got to think about this. I've taken so many photos, it's hard to pinpoint 1 or 2. But there was one that stands out, and it was on the Coromandel Peninsula in New Zealand. We'd just arrived there for sunrise, and we were overlooking the cliffs. The sun just poked out above the horizon. The light was amazing, the sea was kind of steaming, there was loads of mist coming off the sea, and it was just a fantastic scene. And that's the thing with photographs, it's as much the emotion that you carry behind your own photographs as anything that makes them special for you. So it may not be technically the most perfect image, but that's one of the ones that I really love, and it just takes me back to being in New Zealand, which as a photographer, it's an amazing place to visit. And we really can't wait to go back to New Zealand again, because it's one of those places that when you're driving, you'll literally be stopping every 100 meters because there's something new to photograph. Now, one of the photographs I'd like to take again is at Mount Bromo in Indonesia. It's of this moonscape of all of these different craters. There's an active volcano in there. There's Semeru, I think it is, erupting in the background every 20 minutes. I got some fantastic photos, and if you've been following any of my tutorials, you'll have seen them every now and then. The ones that I got that I really like are the close-ups, but then I got a super wide, and I pretty much messed up the shot, and it was a really nice sunrise, and if I'm brave enough, I'll put it on the screen now. But there was a beautiful sunrise. The clouds didn't quite catch that sunrise enough, but I had the camera on a tripod, and we were perched on the edge of this cliff, and I think the tripod was on a branch that was moving ever so slightly. And it just caused a little bit of blur in the shot, and I thought I got it well, but then when I came to edit it, it was a little bit blurry. So that's one place I'd like to go back to. And to be honest, I could go back to Mount Bromo time and time again because it is out of this world, And it's one of those places, again, where you'll have lots of different opportunities to photograph. So I'd say Mount Bromo is the place that I'd love to go back to and take the photograph again. Right, I think that's it. Now, if you like this video and want to see more, I'm currently doing a street photography series around Bangkok. It's a fun genre that I'm learning at the moment, and I'm a photographer, but I'm new to street photography, and it is teaching me so much about my own photography. So if you haven't seen it already yet, click on this video next. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography. I'll see you next time.